Today we will speak about qualitative studies in software engineering. Last time we saw laboratory experiment, and which are mainly quantitative because they deal with numbers. And today we will focus on a range of studies that cover and that are present in the different strategies that we listed in the introductory part. And these are the qualitative studies that deal with concepts and words. Here you have a reference for a book that is quite extensive. Is not strictly focused on software engineering because, as you see, it's social research methods, but it gives you a clear overview and also detailed guidelines on how to conduct this type of studies. And the presentation is based also on this book. So, qualitative study, what are qualitative studies? Well, a qualitative study is the application of any empirical investigation strategy, so a field study, a field experiment, a survey, any strategy, where you use qualitative data collection and qualitative data analysis methods. While quantitative methods will deal with numbers, qualitative methods are those that deal with concepts and words. So we have made this distinction quite clear. Qualitative studies are quite typical of social sciences, so anthropology, psychology, sociology, these type of sciences that focus mostly on human aspects. And since software engineering, as we said, has both a technical and a human facet, whenever you have to investigate some aspect that is less technical and more human, you may need to resort to qualitative studies. In addition, you may need to resort to qualitative studies when you are still in an exploratory phase of your problem and you don't know much. So the main sources of information are not the precise measures of some variables, but the actual concept that you can elicit from the people by interviewing them, by observing them, by asking them questions about their daily work. So this is why qualitative studies are important also in empirical software engineering. Very often, qualitative studies are treated as a synonym of ethnography. Ethnography is actually a quite general term that is typically used in social sciences, and indicate when a researcher goes in a certain field, it performs a certain field study. So the researcher goes in a certain community and observes the community, interview people belonging to the community. For example, I don't know, there are studies in sociology in community of drug addicts in metropolitan areas, and these people stay with them and interview them. Of course, you understand easily that there is a difference between what the social scientists do, so investigate corner cases or particular situations of humans, like in this case the drug addicts, and the empirical software engineer that will interview developers and will stay in contact with developers. There are of course radical differences in terms of environment, but the research strategies are the same. In addition, qualitative studies in software engineering do not include just field studies, so ethnography, but also other types of studies, and we will see some example. So remember that qualitative studies are important because software engineering is a socio-technical field, and the social aspects can be better identified by means of techniques that come from the social sciences, like qualitative studies and ethnography. At the same time, they are important when you need to explore a certain field. You don't know much a certain company or a certain domain. Let's go back also to our to our lecture about building theories, we remember that there were three main approaches: inductive, deductive, and abductive. The typical approach used in qualitative studies is the inductive approach. So I start from the data, I collect data, start by observing reality, and I pass from data to theory. Here we have also a step of operationalization that in the experiment, as you remember, operationalization was translating also identifying also variables and then mapping these variables into measures afterwards. In this case, operationalization is a concept that is more conceptual, let's say. We will see some cases, some example during when we will illustrate techniques for qualitative data analysis. But at this stage, remember that while in quantitative studies and lab experiment, you have well-defined variables and this type of well-defined concepts. In quantitative studies, you have conceptual elements that are quite different, more abstract, and less measurable. But still, operationalization is somehow a way of structuring the concepts that emerge from the reality. And then you pass towards the theory. The theory, like in the example that we saw in the first lecture, that was starting from interviewing people, conceptualizing, and then creating a theory of constructs and proposition, and possibly afterwards passing to a deductive approach in which you actually experiment some of the proposition that you have derived from the theory. If you this is to recall you these terms and to let you understand that everything that we explain throughout this course is connected to the main goal, that is building theories and evaluating theories. Okay. In our presentation today, we will focus on qualitative data collection and mostly on interviews and observation, but also we will see some examples of archival data collection. And then in the other lecture, we will focus on qualitative data analysis, and in particular on a technique that is widely used and also widely misused, that is named grounded theory. In practice, grounded theory, as it's written here, it takes into account also data collection, because it's an iterative process of building theory based on the data and guiding also the selection of new data, new samples. But in this case, it is sufficient if we use grounded, if we distinguish between qualitative data collection based on interviews and observation and qualitative data analysis based on grounded theory. But we will see better later on. So let's put this in our diagram from the ABC of software engineering. Here you see is more chaotic with respect to laboratory experiments, which are well defined and were well positioned in a specific corner of our diagram. Qualitative studies are actually studies that that appear in that can be used for different strategies. Mostly they are used in the case of field studies and field experiments. Why? Because these are the type of studies that are closer, let's say, to ethnography in social sciences. They are used also in judgment studies, because the judgments are most of the cases qualitative, so you need some qualitative strategy to analyze this, to analyze the data from the judgment studies. And to a certain extent, they are used also in experimental simulation, in sample studies, so in questionnaires and surveys, because you may have a questionnaire that has closed question, but you may have a questionnaire with open-ended questions. So in this case, you have several sentences in a way that is quite similar to an interview. So the analysis that you do is made on words, not actually on single selected items. It's not just numerical, but may need some at least some pre-processing at the qualitative level. And also for formal theory, especially when you are performing systematic literature review. Very often you will see that you have to inspect the literature, inspect the papers, and select information from this paper. So it is a qualitative study activity. It doesn't involve typical, let's say, qualitative data collection such as interviews and observation, but since it builds on written papers, on written literature, it needs techniques for qualitative data analysis. For simulation, experimental simulation are basically simulated field experiments in a sense. So in the same way as you collect information in a qualitative way in a field experiment, similarly you can do in experimental simulation. But let's see some example. One thing that I would like to remark, we will see better field experiments and field studies when we will discuss another concept, another name. That is case studies. Okay, case studies are basically all the studies that you do in a company or in a certain group of companies, okay, in which the researcher actually studies a specific context, a specific context, or a limited set of contexts, but in depth. And of course, in these cases, you may also perform some actual measures. Field experiments also suggest this, but in reality, you often use mixed methods. Well, let's see some example. The only thing is that here you have to consider that qualitative methods are very, very unlikely to be used for laboratory experiment and computer simulations. But all the other strategy may use a qualitative method, and let's say to publish qualitative results is really key. As scientists, we are in use of trusting just the numbers, but as a researcher, especially in the software engineering field, especially at the beginning, it's really, really important that instead of understanding the numbers, you really understand the environment of the developers, the environment of the testers, because as I remarked several times in the first lecture, every context is different, every company has a specific process, and mastering qualitative methods is key also for more in-depth research, for understanding which are the real problems in a certain reality, understand which are also the key laboratory experiments that later on you want to perform, because you go in a company, you understand the environment, you understand the problems. After identifying the same problem in several companies, you want to perform a certain experiment to see how to best measure the behavior that you observe, and to better generalize. So let's see, qualitative studies are based mostly on the analysis of interviews with people, so developers, users, testers, etc. Observation of people at work, as we said, testing activities, group meetings. So you stay there and you observe people and you watch them working. And analysis of archival data, that can be software documentation, emails, log. Archival data expressed normally in natural language, although it can include also diagram. And here you see a summary basically of the sources of information that you may have for qualitative study. In this slide, the sources of information, this information actually is represented in yellow. A thing that I'd like to remark is that in interviews, you have the words of the people. In observation, there is a radical difference, because it's you observing the people and taking notes. In documentation and emails, you do not directly observe the people, but you indirectly observe the products of them. So as it is worth remarking that that there is a different distance between the subject and the subject who produced certain information and you. Okay, because for example, people in interviews may speak about their experience, but you are not actually seeing their experience. It's filtered by their eyes. On the other hand, you cannot access their mind without an interview. With observation, you look at the behavior of people at work or during meetings, so you may observe things that they don't even perceive, but at the same time, you don't know how do they interpret that particular environment. So somewhat your point of view there is even stronger than in an interview where the other subject is speaking. And in the documentation and emails, you see somehow an objective product, but at the same time, you may not be able to access what was in the mind of the author when he produced that documentation, what was the specific context, so it may be hard to understand. So this is to let you understand that having something written down may mean many things, because it may refer to an experience that has been processed by a subject, but it may refer to something that you are writing down because you are observing it, so you are interpreting that specific reality, or it may refer to something that was related to a certain reality in a previous period of time when the documentation was produced, and now you may not access not even the subject to produce that document. So you have to rely on the document only on the document themselves. Examples. Let's see some examples. That is the easiest thing, and so that you see that everything is a qualitative study here, but sources are different, and you have different flavors. So first example is interviews. In this example, I want to understand how developers see tests and vice versa to possibly develop better collaboration strategies. So I'm in a company. I want to understand. I see that there is some some separation and some mistrust, some absence of trust between developers and testers, and we want to develop a better way for them to communicate to each other. So I decided to interview groups of developers and testers in the specific company to understand what's wrong with the other roles. The other case, maybe with observation, the other example, I want to observe the meeting in a company, the meeting in a software company. For example, there are these stand-up meeting in agile development. I want to observe these meetings to understand which are the typical patterns of communication. So if there is, what is the role of the Scrum Master, who for different roles, let's say in this type of processes. What is the role of certain developers? What is the role of expert developers against novice developers, etc. So, which are the typical way that people act in the meeting, and how do they communicate with each other? If there is, for example, a tendency of someone to speak more than the others, and the others mostly stay silent. This type of situations. Again, everything, both in the case of interviews and observation, you are, let's say, analyzing the phenomenon. Also, because this may help somewhat the company itself. In these examples, you need also some psychological skills to understand which can be, and you may need the support actually of a psychologist to be, because you may observe things that are more technical, and on the other hand, a psychologist may see some behavioral patterns that are well framed and conceptualized in their discipline. So consider that here we are always speaking about interviews, observation, and other types of data collection activities performed by the software engineers. But sometimes the software engineers alone cannot identify some aspects that are purely anthropological or psychological. So you may need to involve with you in the observation or in the analysis, at least, of the interviews, someone else who has experience on the concept paradigms and terminology of psychology and sociology. Finally, the other example is analysis of archival data. Analyze the documentation to understand which are the common elements between different types of systems of the same company. For example, because I want to create a common generic platform. This is quite common. For example, I was involved in this initial study in which there was a company who was always developing different version basically of the same systems, but it was a large company. And so all these systems were treated like different products. So you had a requirement document, very long requirement document for one product. And the second product was basically covering 90% of the same functionalities, but it was a different document with some requirements taken from the other one, some additional requirements, some elaboration made by different people. So you have to consider that at a certain point the company was saying, hey, here we are reinventing the wheel every time. So we need to capitalize on what we have. So we want to take this documentation and aggregate, find the commonalities between this software and this product, and have a common platform. So this analysis of archival data actually also has a, let's say, a function that is extremely useful for the company itself. So anytime you do a study, anytime you do a study of this type, you understand that it's not just you take information from the company, because the company, to release some information, also needs something back. And this analysis of archival data is the typical case in which you are giving something back, because you analyze the documentation, you perform this study, you find the common elements, you may publish what you have achieved, but at the same time the company has a very important result, because they have a common platform based on all the requirements that they've developed, on the products that they've developed across time. Of course, a theoretical common platform in terms of a requirements document, but still is already a very good contribution to the company itself. These were example made based on the data collection activities that were possible. And now let's see some example by strategy to show you that the diversity also of the possibility that you may have based on your interest. Here, the topic for all these studies is requirements defects. So as I said in the first lecture, you have this requirement document that can be software requirements document, business requirements document, functional requirements document. Imagine it's a document written in natural language that is maybe oriented to different subjects, and basically includes what the software is supposed to do, simply. And in general, it's written in natural language. And of course, since it's written in natural language, so in Italian or in English, and since it's written most of the time by technical people and not by literate people with with education in human sciences, it is very often not understandable and full of defects, mostly ambiguity. Okay, so different interpretation may occur from this document. So defects in requirements is a typical topic of research in requirements engineering. So understanding, for example, ambiguity or incompleteness in these documents and so on. It's not a matter of typos or grammatical errors. It's also a matter of grammatical errors many times, but it is also a matter of inherent ambiguity of natural language. So, for example, if I want to understand what are the typical defects of requirements in a certain company, I may perform a field study. So I'm entering the company, I interview people for example, developers that are like the one who received these requirements from the requirements analyst, and I ask them which are the main pain points with the requirements, and I ask the same questions to the managers to see what are the different viewpoints. In this case, my focus is on the specific context of the company, because I want to elicit some evidence that is specific for the company itself. I may perform after, for example, after performing the field study to understand which were the typical defects and which were the different perspectives of the different roles, I may have developed with other researchers at the universities or with students a new tool for automated analysis of the requirements document, a tool that uses natural language processing, so automatic analysis of the text, and that allows you to identify this requirements defect. And I want to experiment, to test to which extent this tool actually works. In this case, I'm performing a field experiment because I focus on the context, but I am introducing a modification in this context, introducing a modification in the company. So I want to see, for example, how much is improved the quality of the requirements document, or the so-called review process, if there was a review process for requirements in the specific company. So here the focus is on context and improvement for field experiment, but still this still is a qualitative example. I think that I want to understand, I'm interviewing people, I'm observing people at work. I have not just possibly a numerical feedback, for example, counting how many defects were found, but also how useful this tool is, how better the work is after introducing this tool. And the other case, these are the typical cases in which you use qualitative studies, and that's why I mark them in red. So when I speak about qualitative studies, I mostly refer to this type of situations. So, but of course, qualitative studies, as I said, can be applied also to sample studies, formal theories, and judgment study. For example, I still want to know about defects, and I may perform a survey, a questionnaire, and I give the questionnaire to different people from different companies, and I ask them which are the major issues in requirements that you experience in your company. This, instead of being focused on a specific context, is aimed at generalizing over a different context. Okay, so is oriented to understand what's going on in the average company. Okay, while in the previous case you wanted to understand what's going on in the specific company because you wanted to solve the problem of the company. So, and you understand that for this different goal you are using different studies. Another case may be the case in which I perform a literature review. So for my theory, I search the literature for evidence of problems related to requirements and propose solution in existing works. So this may be a study that I may combine also with the field study and the field experiments. Why? Because I may want to focus on historical problems that are general over context because they are coming from other empirical research. So I can gather information to build a theory that covers a larger scope of interest with respect to my company, and then I perform the field study to understand which is the typical in which way this theory manifests itself in the specific company, and the field experiment to understand how to create a solution theory for the specific company. As you see, the terms that we've been using about theories are strictly connected with everything we do. Finally, there is a judgment study. Also, judgment studies, as I was simplifying before, is a study in which I may perform qualitative analysis, qualitative data collection, and qualitative analysis. Again, my topic is requirements analysis, and I ask a series of expert requirements analysts, so people who normally review this document and that normally write down this document. I asked these requirements analysts from different companies to analyze a requirements document and explain the main defects of the document, and explain in which way these defects differ from typical defects that they encounter in their daily work. So basically, the idea is you have a series of experts, also contacted via email or via Skype, that are far away from you. You want to interview them by triggering them by triggering the information from them. And how do you do it? You ask them to do a simple task that is somehow not an actual experiment. You don't get the data from this task, but you want to get you don't get the quantitative data from this task, so you don't want to know how many defects are identified by these people, but it is used just to trigger their mind toward thinking about defects, thinking in which way the document is different from the documents that they write or that they review in their company, and discuss the main problems with requirements. In this case, while in the other case you were focusing on historical problems that were already written down in the literature, with the judgment study you are focusing more on today's problem, in a contemporary problem from the perspective of experts, and you are generalizing over context. Why this can be useful in this context? Because, for example, in the last years, with the birth of agile methods in software engineering, requirements are written in a completely different way. Before, you were writing the so-called should requirements, so the system should, when a certain action occurs, the system should do produce some output. Now, requirements are written as so-called user stories. So they're written as a user, I want to perform some action. As a certain role, I want to perform some action. And this change is a change on the way requirements are written, but also, of course, in the process, and may impact on the type of defects that you have, on the type of problem that you meet, because, of course, requirements problems are also connected to the actual process in which these requirements live. So different effects may emerge in relation to the process itself. So you may not find this information in the literature, so you perform a judgment study, because still you want to generalize over different contexts, but at the same time you don't have enough information to perform a survey, for example, and you don't have enough literature to perform a literature review. Okay, so from this discussion, you see that the topic is basically the same, is requirements defect, but the strategies are completely different, still qualitative, but different based on the focus and on the knowledge that you have of a certain topic, and the goal that you have, whether it's studying the topic or improving a certain situation. So let's go more deep into a comparison between quantitative and qualitative studies. The overall process is similar between the two studies. So we start always with a research question. We collect data, we analyze the data, and we answer our question. And this is the typical ingredient of any empirical study. But some differences exist. The main difference, as you are dealing with words and not with numbers, is the degree of objectivity of the data analysis process. Why? Because in quantitative studies, our goal is to be objective and repeatable. In qualitative studies, I accept the subjectivity that is inherent to the interpretation of the data, as we saw with the brief overview of interviews and observation. If you are observing a situation, you are filtering with your experience and your eyes, and your background. If you are listening to someone that is bringing you information, so in an interview about a certain field, you are filtering with the eye of the person and the second filter of yourself interpreting what the person is saying. So the qualitative studies are keen to accept the act of interpreting the data and an inherent subjectivity. At the same time, the goal is still to do science. So if not full objectivity, you need to provide evidence that your interpretation is actually grounded on the data. That's why it's called, the technique that we will discuss is called grounded theory. It's grounded on the data, is clearly derived from the data, so from the interview transcripts, for example, in a sound and reasonable way. So you need to make evident that the theory you are proposing is based on some evidence that you are collected throughout a somewhat replicable process, at least. Replicable process and a process that can be followed. The process can be repeatable, but another subject may conclude with way different conclusions. This is fair. This is accepted, okay, in qualitative research. So it is not a threat to validity, the subjectivity, because it's part of qualitative research. So in this module, as said, we will see data collection and data analysis methods that are more appropriate for qualitative studies. Let's see better. Let's remember what is the characteristic of quantitative studies, so that we see a comparison of the process. As I said, we start from a research question, a set of research questions, but in quantitative studies, research questions are normally derived from a theory. So we remember there was a set of propositions, a set of constructs that belong to a theory, and leads me to express research question, hypotheses, and variables, and to assess the theory. Okay, to reject my hypothesis my null hypothesis, if you remember the terminology. Here, the lab experiments is something to a certain extent linear, although nothing is linear, because as we know, research questions will change until the end, until the very end, until the moment in which the paper and your research is published. So there is some form of iteration. But qualitative studies are much more iterative. In this case, the key thing that you have to look at, the key difference is that the theory is not anymore on the left side, is not the starting point, but is the point of arrival. And the steps are more simplified, is less structured, and you have to consider that is extremely iterative. You start from a research question, you define a research design. In this case, as you see, I'm not including hypotheses, constructs, variables, this type of things, because here is often oriented actually to identify which are the constructs of the theory itself. So from the research question and research design, identify the data that allows me to identify constructs and prepositions. So the data is the starting point, and the process is different from the one that you use in quantitative research. So anyway, you start from a research question, use a research design, you decide a research design. For example, you decide whether to use interviews or observation. Then you recruit the participants or select artifacts, because we remember we can interview people, observe people, or analyze documents. Then you start collecting your data, analyzing the data. The results that you may get at this point by analyzing your data, that means actually inspecting these interviews and underlining parts and tagging them with labels. We will see examples when we will discuss grounded theory, but it's basically analyzing and writing labels, writing memos, notes, this type of things. And this may change your research questions, your research design, because it may lead you to select new people to interview, new people to sample, new situation to observe. So it is always a cyclic process, a cycle, multiple cycle. And at the end, you consider different type of validity. Another difference is the types of validity, which will be discussed at the end of the second lecture. And you again report the answers with respect to research question. And finally, you get to a theory. So these are the main difference. So remember, theory in quantitative studies is normally the starting point. In qualitative studies is the final point, is the point of arrival. In quantitative studies, you start from the theory and you operationalize your constructs. In this case, you are eliciting your constructs and preposition directly from the data. Of course, the difference is that also full control is limited. That's why the control here comes from several iterations that allows you to better understand what you're dealing with. Again, quantitative versus qualitative. What are in detail the differences? Quantitative focus on numbers, is researcher driven, so the researcher is actually controlling the setting. The researching is distant, so is distant from the object of research, so there is some form of objectivity. The theory is tested against the data, what I said before. The approach is somewhat linear, so as I said, there are of course exceptions, but in general there is a well-defined sequence of steps that you need to follow. It is structured, well structured, let's say, with a series of steps. It is oriented to generalization, so is oriented to generalize and to understand with some precision the behavior of actors. It is based on hard, reliable data, numbers, and is oriented actually to understand the behavior, as we mentioned several times. And the setting is artificial. Instead, in qualitative research, the setting is natural. You are oriented to meaning. Instead of having numbers, you have rich, deep data, which are the words. Context-oriented, so your focus is on a specific, well-defined context. As we saw also from the diagram, these type of studies are mostly used in field studies and field experiment, which aim to better understand the specific context and do not generalize over multiple contexts. They are unstructured, so less structured, let's say, and iterative. In this case, again, the theory emerges from the data, and the researcher is very close to the data source. So there is a participation and an unavoidable bias and subjectivity. They are driven by the participants. So the researcher is not constraining the environment, let's say, in any way. It's the participant that produce the data, and the focus is somewhat the way the research evolves is decided also based on the data of your participants, and of course it's based on words, but also diagrams, images, anything that can be expressed with words, because remember, what you analyze in the end is what's written, also in observation, but the source of data may be also something that you see with your eyes, some behavior, something that you feel. So the source of data is the reality as a world, which is multimodal. So it has images, it has all the senses that are present in a certain environment. But the coding is words, because this is the way that we interpret and we communicate the world to our peers. The difference, of course, is never strict, as for any conceptualization. Why? Here you see the most the cases, the aspects, let's say, the features that are most different between the two types of studies. Why? Here you see some remarks on the differences that are that indicate that the differences are not so strong for some cases. For example, behavior versus meaning. Quantitative studies also often are oriented to understand why and to understand the meaning of certain behavior. And at the same time, qualitative studies also search for patterns and behavior, like in the example that I was illustrating concerning the meeting in a company. So I'm searching for communication patterns, so some typical behavior that can lead me to answer some why questions about the environment. Testing a theory or eliciting the theory from the data. Also in quantitative studies, very often you do not have well-established theory, especially in software engineering, because in some cases you don't have enough information to build the theory, but well, your problem is at the same time is quite clear and easy to isolate that you want to perform an experiment anyway, but some initial iteration is always needed. As I said, the research question, they change over time. So the linearity is just an hypothesis. At the same time, qualitative studies cannot assume that no pre-existing theory exists, at least in the mind of the researcher. You of course, the more experience you have, as the paradox is that the more experience you have as a qualitative researcher, so in interviewing people, in doing this type of studies, the more likely is that you have some paradigms in your mind, some way of filtering reality, some way of seeing things, and some patterns of interpretation. So these patterns of interpretation is your theory, and you cannot assume that the researcher does not have any pre-existing theory. So because any process of conceptualization assumes that you have some strategies of conceptualizing in your mind, and these strategies you have learned in previous similar activities. So it is very difficult to say no theory exists. No theory can exist, and everything is elicited from the evidence, from the data. Numbers versus words. Of course, words are more commonly used in qualitative studies, but I can count the words and I can see how relevant is a certain concept. And I can use qualitative data, but I can extract quantitative information. For example, occurrences of certain terms in the tweets that allows me to understand the sentiment of the tweets. You may have heard about these activities of sentiment analysis to understand how polarized are certain tweets oriented, for example, to understand what is how much people support a certain politician, and how many people instead write angry tweets about him or her. And finally, natural versus artificial. Actually, is it natural to perform an interview? Well, to a certain extent, yes, because you normally ask questions to people, but it is not something that happens normally, to have people standing there and answering just your question. And the second thing is that do I really get the information I need? Because people tend to say things that may be different from reality, and also from what they think, because they want you to, especially in a developing company, in a software company, they may think something but may not be allowed to tell you, or may not want to disclose certain information also about their perception of their peers, because they have some fear that you may change your opinion about them or whatever. So people not necessarily tell you what they think or how things are. So here is a quite important picture for this lecture, because is a picture that lets you understand how all the fragments, all the elements are connected. So on one end I have the source of data that can be people, documents, and system. Then I have the data collection activity that can be performed by means of inquisitive techniques, and we will see the example of interviews, and I will explain you how to conduct interviews. Observational techniques, and we will see the example of observation. And archival data collection, which is mining logs, software documentation, emails, etc. So in this case, archival data get the data from documents mostly, but can get also log data, for example, from the system, from the behavior of the system. All these qualitative data is analyzed by means of grounded theory. Grounded theory in this lecture, in this class, includes thematic analysis and a crucial element that is coding. There is some disagreement in the terminology, but to explain that the theory, thematic analysis, and coding to you, I think it is good to see them as embedded in each other and as different elements included in each other. So to go more deep into the content of the figure. So the source of qualitative data, as we said, is people and documents, but also systems. We do not consider in this lecture the systems as source of data. Because normally they are used, the output from system or related to system, strictly related to system, is treated in an aggregate form and automatically processed. So code information, data log, when the information is too much, is automatically processed and is more the topic of mining software repositories. So we will treat them as a separate topic, completely separate topic, because the analysis in the end is focused on quantities, and there is a qualitative aspect that you may introduce, but the structure, the overall framework is completely different. Okay. Data collection, we will see, as said, interviews, observation, and archival data collection. Also, surveys and questionnaire may collect qualitative data as exemplified, but since they are oriented mostly for quantitative data, we treat, since they are very important as a separate research strategy, we treat them in a separate lecture. And data analysis techniques, if you search in internet for data analysis techniques, there are over 20 different techniques with different names and different characteristics, but we will focus on this grounded theory / thematic analysis. Grounded theory and on the main tool used for qualitative analysis in general, for any qualitative analysis, that is coding. That means simply associating some conceptual labels, tags, to certain textual fragments. So conceptual labels that indicate some concept, so the constructs, some meaning, to textual fragments, and then connecting these fragments. So you already understand what are the basic principles of grounded theory, of thematic analysis and grounded theory. As said, grounded theory and thematic analysis are different in principle, but we treat them as included in each other. So thematic analysis is part, in this case, of grounded theory. In practice, in the papers, you see that people normally mention that they have performed thematic analysis because if they use the term grounded theory, since it is an approach that has different interpretation, if the reviewer, the person who reads the paper, is an expert on one of the parties or on one of the different schools of grounded theory, they will be really nitpicker with the reporting of your strategy. So the best way is to use a term that is normally more vague, that is thematic analysis in the paper, but still in practice follow the steps of grounded theory. Something more on data collection techniques. So you remember that you've seen this table before. There are first degree, second degree, and third degree techniques. We will look in inquisitive techniques, observational techniques, and also third degree techniques, in particular archival data collection. And here you see a better focus with the connection between the specific technique and the goal. In interviews and surveys, questionnaire that we will treat in another lecture, your goal is to collect general information, but also opinions about process, products, knowledge, etc. The volume of data is small to large, so a large amount of information is normally produced because the interviews may last quite long. Participant observation, if your goal is deep understanding for the goal, rationale of action, and in a period of time that is quite long. So you want to observe actually the reality, not having that reported. And archival data collection, and when you want to focus on the practice more related to design and documentation, because you're dealing with documents. And the volume of data is medium. In general, with archival data collection, since this paper is from 2005, the paper from which I took the table, mining software repositories, it was not so common. In mining software repository, which is somewhat part of this archival data collection strategy, we know that we deal with large volume of data. But again, in this context, the focus is on qualitative data, and so also for archival data collection, we will mostly deal with medium data with a medium volume.